The Philippines is much more than what it seems, much more than what some people give it credit for, much more than what it now is. It's not an American territory or a Spanish colony. It's more than that. The Philippine Islands has its own history and heritage, a history and heritage that was nearly forgotten by the hundreds of years of Spanish conquest and American control. When the Spanish foreigners came to the islands, they destroyed the kingdoms and dynasties that were already existing there. Native Filipino customs and identity were nearly destroyed by the Latin culture that engulfed all of what anyone would now consider to be the Philippine Islands. Few records remain as to what existed before the Spanish destruction. What has been discovered was not only native dynasties such as Luzon, but there were actually native Philippine writing scripts, the sign of a developed nation and of a powerful empire. People may never know the maximum extent of what kind of language existed in the Philippines before the Spanish destruction, or how many total written languages existed. But we do know of a few examples that survived even when the Spanish attempted to erase its existence. One of the most extensive is the Babayin, as we now consider it today to be a true native Philippine written language. Visually, the letters look astonishing. To the untrained eye, it looks roughly Indian, which it is, as this language is a variation of the Sanskrit used in India, giving credit to the ancient myth that most of Southeast Asia was mostly Indianized except for certain regions, notably Annam and Luzon, which were Sinicized, even though there is evidence that shows that Luzon also had ancient Japanese influence as well. At this point in time, there's no absolute universally agreed explanation as to how the Babayin was created. One theory suggests that the language came to that region of the Philippines through trade with the other island empire of Southeast Asia, Srivijaya, as the Babayin is similar to Javanese, the language of Srivijaya and predecessor of Indonesian. One interesting fact of the Babayin is that in the traditional way of writing it, you would write the characters from the bottom to the top, an unusual method of writing. Another different method of writing would be Arabic, where the characters are written from right to left. To have a written language this complex shows an excellent example as to how complex the Babayin is. Not all of the islands that make up the modern nation of the Philippines used the Babayin. Another example being the southern Philippines, which was the realm of the Sulu. This region used Arabic, but this is not native Filipino but Middle Eastern origin. Babayin is considered native Filipino script, as why many Filipino people are fascinated with it when they learn of its existence. Let's compare the ancient Babayin written language, which is true Filipino, to a modern definition of native Filipino language. The Tagalog spoken language is the only example currently of a quote-unquote native Filipino language, when it's essentially a mix of various native Filipino languages, Spanish and English. Hardly native, true ethnic Filipino, as Babayin is more of a pure Filipino language than Tagalog is in some circumstances. When the Spanish first arrived in the islands, they were amazed that this was no haven of savages, but the islands were home to advanced empires and using written language, the Babayin being one of them. The Babayin script was actually in use during the Spanish colonial era, being in widespread use and public knowledge until the late 1800s, which was at that time roughly the end of Spanish rule. The end came because by this time nearly all of the Philippines was completely Latinized, with only certain regions escaping this fate. With the Spanish rule, native Filipino culture and identity were replaced with Latin aspects. Native Filipino names were replaced with Spanish names, cities and islands were renamed with Spanish names, and lastly, language was changed. The Babayin, along with other written languages, was not passed to future generations because previous ones did not have the time to teach it to their descendants, or believed it to be hedonistic and outdated, favoring Spanish or later English when the Americans took over from Spain in controlling the islands. In the modern Philippines, the Babayin language is not necessarily understood. first reason being that after independence, Babayin was not known among the people enough to be the national language, seeing how by this time in the 1940s, the first generation of Filipino leaders were roughly the grandsons of the last Babayin writers. Thus, they did not know the language, and it was not viable as the language of the country. If the leaders did not know the language, then how would the people? Second reason that English seemed more favorable than the Babayin as the national language along with Tagalog. Both were in use and much easier to teach in some ways than the Babayin. Third reason being that Babayin was never standardized, as there were different regional variations of the language. One written text may appear slightly different if it was read in different regions of the country. There was never any single form of the language adopted anywhere in the Philippines. There are obvious reasons why the written language is not the official script of the country today. Some might be wondering, would Babayin ever be readopted on the national level? Possibly yes, possibly no. Again, there were other forms of written language in the Philippines before the Spanish destruction. Yet the Babayin seems to be one of the few examples that can be retaught on a nationwide level. When the Spanish destroyed native Philippine culture to replace it with the Latin culture, the Filipino people were forced to read, speak, and write in Spanish. There might have been even more advanced script than the Babayin, but we will never know. All that remains is the Babayin and a few other written examples of native Filipino text. My own personal view is that there is a slight chance, with China retaking its position as the most powerful Asian nation, all countries in Northeast and Southeast Asia are slowly appreciating their own Asian cultures once more. There's no more absolute faith in westernization. The Philippines might appreciate its own ancient culture, what is left of it, and might want to recreate it for future generations. It might be taught regionally at first, and this might spread to other areas, and then finally, possibly on a nationwide level. Even if the Babayin written script does not ever gain widespread understanding again, there are still those people who know of its existence. It survives, despite the Spanish attempts to destroy it. It survives, and with that a whole new generation of Filipino people will learn who they are and what it means to them. It survives, and an international audience can see just how advanced the islands of the Philippines once was.